Believe it or not, there is another content warning about this video because we're going to be talking about the true history and truth behind the character of Captain Marvel, aka Carol Danvers. And in order to do that, we're going to have to dig in to the worst Marvel comic ever published. So there is a little content warning on this video. I'm not sure if you want to have kids watch this video, but you have been forewarned. So with the recent news of Avengers Doomsday casting, not all the cast have been released, but a lot of people were noting that in the well over 20 names that we got, we didn't get a lot of female characters, which makes a lot of people think that Marvel is finally pulling back on its push to have just a boatload of female characters in their movie, pushing them front and center. And amongst the characters that did not appear on the list so far was Captain Marvel, the character promoted originally as being one of Marvel's flagship characters. They wanted her to not only be their flagship female character, there was even a push for a time to make her the face of the Marvel universe. And if you lived through that, you know how much Captain Marvel was just everywhere. But the rumor is now that I'm hearing that not only it was Captain Marvel not announced on the initial list of Avengers Doomsday characters, but that she isn't in the movie at all. That's a pretty big deal after this character was pushed so relentlessly for years, but it also makes perfect sense from a business standpoint because exactly who likes Captain Marvel? She's a completely hated character. She's not only been a punching bag for people who watch the MCU, talking about just how unlikable she is, but she's definitely become an icon of sorts for the movement of strong female characters, or should I say bad strong female characters, girl boss characters, shallow token characters. This character has become absolutely hated and absolutely kicked around to death by everyone. And now it seems that the MCU is just leaving her out to dry. I mean, maybe the character will appear in Secret Wars, but I wouldn't put it to think that she's going to have a big role because no one is asking for this character. And even Brie Larson became completely disillusioned with the role. But the truth of the matter is, I don't hate the character of Captain Marvel, and I don't hate the character of Carol Danvers, because I know who they're actually supposed to be, and the actual truth behind it and how this character has been used and what she exposes about the movement to get strong female characters or girl boss characters or feminist icons in media like this. The truth that her history reveals is really sad, and it's sad because we've seen history repeat itself with this character. These days, you see, some people out there screaming at Marvel for not having these female characters like Captain Marvel and so many others that they invented in their era of a deluge of female characters to try to respond to criticism. There are people who are angry about them not showing up. And I want to say these people who promoted these female characters and stood on their side and would not accept anybody else who criticized them are so in the wrong more than they can ever know. And they actually help damage female characters in stories by doing that, and they don't understand what exactly they are supporting with having characters like Captain Marvel out there, the damage that caused, and the shallow hypocrisy behind it all. I want to get into the real truth behind Carol Danvers and what she exposes, once again, about tokenism with female characters, and what happens when companies try to capitalize on having more female characters as a trend. The truth is, Carol Danvers has probably the saddest history of any comic book character ever, and that she exposes the truth behind tokenism. By that I mean putting female characters in media for show, which is what I believe they did with every single one of the female characters that they promoted during the latest phases of the MCU. And I think that this storyline is important in understanding exactly what's happening and the negative things that are continuing happening today with the depiction of female characters. Carol Danvers was originally a love interest for the original Captain Marvel, who was a man, in 60s comics. She was just a supporting character, who eventually got his powers during an accident where he tried to save her. During the late 70s, she was selected to be a character called Miss Marvel. Now, while the name has changed to something more gender neutral, now you have to understand that even naming the character Miss, that was actually considered a feminist statement at the time for the women's lib movement, aka second wave feminism. Of course, if you read the history of her coming about and getting a new comic from Jerry Conway, who initially wrote the comic, apparently there just wasn't a lot of thought put into it. They just wanted a new female character on the line. So Miss Marvel, Carol Danvers, was presented very much the way she was today. She was supposed to be an icon for the feminist movement at the time. She was a former military pilot. She wrote for a magazine just called Women. She checked the boxes of everything that I guess a feminist character they thought was supposed to look like at the time. The only problem was her stories was terrible. There was nothing to it. It wasn't selling, and there wasn't actually a lot of effort put into the book. That is until Chris Claremont came on board. Now, Chris Claremont is most famously known for his work on the X-Men. He is basically the reason why the X-Men became popular, and he created basically all of Marvel's most popular female superheroes on that lineup. Now, when he took over the book, he started writing Carol as an actual character. During this series, it is actually the series that the character of Mystique was created for, to be an arch nemesis for Miss Marvel, and Chris Claremont had plans that there would be a new storyline where Mystique's daughter, Rogue, would take Miss Marvel's powers and psych, and that there would be a new conflict for her where she would completely lose her memories and have to deal with that. But the series was canceled shortly after that. So just as Chris Claremont was getting aboard the book and actually writing Carol Danvers as an actual character with storylines, the book was just chopped off at just a little over 20 issues. No more Miss Marvel, that was the end of that. So this new feminist character that at the time Marvel Comics had put out there to be their feminist girl icon, role model, and all of that, checking off all the boxes of the women's lib movement at the time, was just canned. After that, Miss Marvel did not have a home as a character, but she was punted off on the Avengers book. And then is when one of the most infamous controversies in Marvel Comics history happened: the publishing of Avengers 200. And this is the comic where the content warning comes in, because this is one of the grossest, if not the grossest, most heinous stories ever published by Marvel Comics. So Miss Marvel's a part of the Avengers, right? Well, the storyline that was published in Avengers 200 is a storyline where Miss Marvel mysteriously becomes pregnant. Yeah. Out of nowhere, she's pregnant, and she has no idea what happened and no idea how it came about, no idea who the father could possibly be. She's just simultaneously pregnant. And within 3 days, she goes through like this rushed pregnancy and gives birth. Yeah, this is happening. She has no idea how and is very visibly uncomfortable by it, but all of the Avengers just kind of smile and treat it casually. Now, what happens in the book, though, gets even weirder and even stranger and even grosser than that. Of course, apparently, unintentionally, what happens is this person who Carol Danvers has supposedly given birth to grows up very quickly and starts to refer to her not only as his mother, but as his lover at the same time. And then eventually this character who has introduced himself as Marcus tells his story, that apparently he is actually the son of a character named Immortus, and Immortus lived in this limbo land that he couldn't escape from. And what he did is he was able to use his powers to take a woman from Earth and basically impregnate her with his essence and give birth to the son that was Marcus in this land. We won't talk about the fact that what this implies is grape here, but don't worry, we're not done with what happens in this comic just yet. But anyway, that is the explanation for how Marcus came to be. But Marcus couldn't find a way out of his land either, even though he existed in this limbo. So he took inspiration from his father and decided that maybe he could impregnate himself and have someone give birth to him so he could live on Earth that way. So what he does in this comic, this is a real comic comic that was published in the early 80s is that he finds Carol Danvers, and that there's even this creepy implication that she looks similar to the character who was forced to be his mother. But he says that he would not dare force himself on her. He would woo her the old-fashioned way. But in this comic, it says that even as he tried to woo her the old-fashioned way, he had to use a subtle boost from his machines to get her to agree to him, submit to him, and become his. And that through that manipulation, through that force, he was able to impregnate her with himself and give birth to himself on planet Earth. Yes, this is a comic that was actually published in an Avengers comic in the 80s. And what happens next is, with the truth revealed, with the idea that apparently Carol Danvers was this guy's mother/lover in another universe, Carol decides that she actually wants to go with him to rediscover that connection that they had. And the Avengers are just fine with it. And the comic ends with that. And that was the Avengers 200 anniversary issue that was released. That was the story. 2 times in the story, it says that 2 characters were SA'd, were raped in this weird incestuous storyline, no less. And no one in the story acts like that is actually what happened, or that that is a problem or anything. Carol is apparently in love with the man who did this to her, and the Avengers are fine with all of it. No one acknowledges it for what it actually is. This was an absolutely disgusting comic, to say the least. Not only that, I think it is the most disgusting comic that Marvel ever published. And to this day, if you are in the comic book reading community and you see forums talking about what was the worst comic that Marvel ever published, what was the most disgusting, this is probably the comic that is going to come up. But what was so unbelievable about it at the time is that this was the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, and comic books were still generally published for kids at the time. They even had the Comics Code Authority, which was a far more strict rating system. I gotta say, as someone who's read a lot of comics from this time, none of them even came close to any pretense of having something like this in it. Somehow it was not only an idea that was greenlit by Marvel editorial, but it got past several layers of leadership, including the Comics Code Authority, and got released. And after it was released, you better believe that there was a very heavy amount of backlash towards this comic when it hit the stands, but it wasn't like it could be today, because in the internet things are instant and people are able to speak up immediately, but they just didn't have that back then. So what happened was, the first person who led the charge against this comic was actually a reader named Carol A. Strickland, and she had to write her response to this comic in a fan magazine, and she wrote a very, very scathing takedown of this comic, pointing out, in fact, this character was SA'd, and they act like the characters are not in this comic, also pointing out this sort of gross, grape, incest storyline that they would possibly publish in a comic at all, let alone one that a bunch of kids were going to be reading. But I went and I read Carol A. Strickland's scathing article about this comic, and I found it very interesting because she did more than just take down the disgusting comic as it was, but she talked a lot about the promotion of female characters in comics at the time. And she talked about how here is Carol Danvers, and she's a character that is put out there as supposedly this icon for little girls, and supposedly this feminist icon to boot. But then they go and they publish this comic and have this done to her. And she says a lot of interesting stuff in the takedown that she wrote. She talks about how Carol Danvers wasn't actually a character and how no one at Marvel Comics seemed to care about her. Chris Claremont was only just getting her off the ground and writing her as an actual character before they canceled the book. But then she brought up the most interesting thing about the article, talking about the difference between how male characters were treated in comics versus female characters in general. She talked about how female characters were always written as female first and characters second, while male characters were written as characters first. Male characters were always written with their development and motivations at the forefront, but female characters were just symbols meant to represent womanhood. Carol Danvers' character, or non-character as it was in these early comics, was just an amalgamation of stuff that sounded good to the women's lib movement, but that beyond that, a lot of writers who weren't Chris Claremont would just write Miss Marvel as an angry feminist stereotype and not giving her really any character or care. She pointed out that Marvel Comics would only publish comics like Miss Marvel as a capitalization on the women's lib movement at the time to make a quick buck, but they didn't actually care about any of these characters, and that was made especially apparent in this Avengers 200 comic, which really showed the true colors of the people behind the scenes, that there was no care about this character. It was just a shallow capitalization of a trend at the time, and a degrading comic like Avengers 200 that can't even seem to understand that something like SA is bad was a real proof of the nature of a lot of the people behind the scenes. However, Carol A. Strickland did single out Chris Claremont and praising him for the way that he would write female characters, and Chris Claremont is responsible for characters like Storm and writing the best storylines for Jean Grey and Kitty Pryde and all of those characters. And she praises Chris Claremont, saying that he actually treats female characters as characters first and women second, not women first and characters second. They're actual people that are enjoyable to read about with their own personalities and developments. They're not just there as shallow cardboard cutouts that are saying the right things to try to capitalize on whatever movement is going on at the time. And that was very interesting to me because it reminded me a lot of the conversation that is still going on today. To this day, there's still pushback about having more female characters in media that is more consumed by men, but oftentimes when they get those female characters, they're nothing more than shallow tokens. They don't have a lot to them. They try to capitalize on feminist ideals at the time and say the right things, but there isn't actually any character behind them. And as such, just like the original run of Miss Marvel was canceled quickly before they could even get it off the ground to make it anything good, that is what happens to female characters these days. But if you aren't winded by the discourse around Avengers 200, which believe me is a very uncomfortable comic to bring up at all, we still have more to talk about and more to bring up regarding my points, because what would happen to the character of Carol Danvers after that, after she was thoroughly degraded in a way more than any other comic book character up to that time? Well, remember, Chris Claremont was singled out by Carol A. Strickland as the one comic book writer at the time across Marvel and DC which was actually writing female characters right, writing them as actual characters. Well, Chris Claremont, to his credit, also came out and condemned the issue of Avengers 200 and said it should have never happened. And what happened is, a year later, Chris Claremont would come out, which was essentially a retraction to Avengers 200, which was published Avengers Annual 10, which, by the way, is Rogue's first appearance in comics. But Avengers Annual 10, once again, served as sort of a retraction to Avengers 200, where they find Carol Danvers after she's had her memories taken from Rogue, and she is able to get some of her memories back, and she remembers what happened with Marcus in Avengers 200, and it essentially retcons it so that she did not want to go with Marcus. She was still under his mind control, and it acknowledges what happened to her was wrong, what happened to her was forced, and she condemns the Avengers, rightly so, for doing nothing to stop it. So the bad thing about this comic is it still confirmed all of those events happened, but the good thing about it is that it actually acknowledged what happened was wrong. So that's kind of unfortunate that Rogue's first appearance in comics ever is now forever known as the Grape Retraction comic, because that's essentially what this was. By the way, as a personal aside, Avengers Annual 10 was one of the first comics I ever read because I was curious about Miss Marvel and got the pack of her original series, and I was traumatized because it does recap the story of Avengers 200, incest, grape, and all, even if it now recontextualizes it as a bad thing, and it made me take a long break from reading comics for a while. But Chris Claremont did what he could. He tried to revive the character of Carol Danvers, and he tried to resurrect the situation that had happened and acknowledge those events of the comic were entirely wrong. But Chris Claremont still had some sort of emotional attachment to Miss Marvel after he had written for her before, and he wanted to try to resurrect the character. So for a while now, Carol Danvers, after her tragedy, was actually written as being a part of the X-Men. And guess what? The character was written great here. And I'm not the only one who thinks so. I actually gave the comics to my brother at the time, and what he told me, unprompted after reading these comics where Carol was on the X-Men, is, wow, Carol Danvers is a great character when she's on the X-Men, and she is. She was no longer a bland, man-hating, feminist stereotype here. She was an actual character with her strengths and weaknesses. She's close friends with Wolverine. She knows how to help her team. She's not perfect, though. She has her flaws. She is headstrong, but she shows how she can pick up the pieces of her life and move on. Carol is a legitimately good character on the X-Men's team. Of course, she wasn't an actual mutant, so Claremont couldn't write her on the team consistently. And as Carol Danvers actually became binary after that, she started to appear less and less in comics. But Chris Claremont tried to keep the character alive. That is why he created this whole thing where Carol Danvers was still basically a ghost in Rogue's mind existing. And while they tell this whole story in miniature in X-Men the Animated Series, it was actually a thing all throughout the 80s where Carol was still in Rogue's mind, and there would be times where Carol would take over and talk to the X-Men and help them out. And once again, she was a great, capable character during this time when she was written there. But once again, she wasn't an actual X-Men character, and they couldn't keep up the Rogue has a subconscious Miss Marvel, Carol Danvers in her mind forever, so that eventually faded away. And the character of Carol Danvers gradually faded away, and she wasn't used for years until the 2000s, where she was finally resurrected as a character. She finally got another chance at a solo series, and it did last a lot longer this time for 50 issues. And she also got an appearance on the Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes show, where, guess what? She was well written again. On Earth's Mightiest Heroes, Carol is also a very capable, headstrong character who's physically strong, but she's also eager to please. She doesn't always have the right answers for everything. Sometimes she's too much of a stickler for the rules. In contrast to a lot that we are going to see from her today, she wasn't entirely confident. This was another example of Carol being a well-done character, and at this time, this was actually when I liked the character a lot, and I thought that she had a lot of potential. But then the second worst thing that ever happened to Carol Danvers happened. The changing of her to Captain Marvel. Now, I say the second worst thing because obviously the worst thing would have been Avengers 200. But you see, while the character was going through a little bit of a resurrection during the 2000s, it was during the 2010s where they started to look at her again as that feminist icon that she was originally supposed to be. There were multiple things fueling this. On the one hand, they saw a character with her power set and were considering having their own Superman. But it soon evolved into this idea that Carol Danvers, they needed a new feminist icon who wasn't a part of the X-Men. Why? Because at the time, the MCU, who is using all these characters, did not have the rights to the X-Men. If they wanted to have a new female character who was strong and in the front and center of everything, who wasn't street level, who didn't fail like Elektra and Catwoman did, then they would need somebody strong like Carol Danvers. And so what they did is they revamped the character of Carol Danvers into Captain Marvel, a gender-neutral name and something that sounds far more marketable in the modern day, as our standards and ideals have changed, I suppose. And once again, they could not get this character to work as a solo character. She was not well written like she was in Earth's Mightiest Heroes or under Chris Claremont. They didn't seem to know what her identity should be. They tried serious comics. They tried to play her up a little bit more goofy in the 2014 series, because that was coming out around the time that Guardians of the Galaxy was there, and maybe that would be a direction for the character. Remember what I was talking about in my Miss Marvel video about how Miss Marvel has just had a million cancellations of books? Captain Marvel had even more. They just could not get this character off the ground. But let me tell you, even though they couldn't get this character off the ground, she wasn't hated at the time. I remember, and as far back as 2014, people just did not hate this character. It's just the current writers at Marvel weren't making her work. But the thing is, because this character had to be used when it came to the movies, they had to keep pushing her. But then came the fateful event that would ruin Captain Marvel into what she is now. After years of not being able to figure out what Carol Danvers' persona as Captain Marvel would be, how to get her to sell in a solo book, for whatever reason, they landed on this persona of a super overconfident, selfish, angry character. And they went forward with this event called Civil War II. Carol becomes responsible for her love interest at the time, Rhodey, getting killed, and she starts putting people in prison. Yet this was supposed to be this new icon, an icon that was being pushed so hard at the time. I remember it being said that Marvel Comics was trying to make her the face of their comics in the way that Spider-Man was supposed to be. So a combination of portraying Carol Danvers that unlikable all of a sudden and pushing her so relentlessly in people's faces, this character was pushed more than any other character at Marvel at the time. People started to straight up despise Carol Danvers, and that is how we got the hate for the character that we see today. All these comics were there to promote the character and make her seem like this big icon at Marvel Comics, but when it came to the promotion of the movie that was building up to this entire time, it actually just prepped people to hate this character, and therefore for there to be a hate train for this character as the movie was coming out. Of course, MCU fans were not familiar with the comics, so they wouldn't be as prone to hate this character. They just thought it was a brand new Marvel Comics character to see in the theaters. And by the way, why was Marvel's first female-led superhero movie coming out now, all the way in 2019, when that phase of the MCU, the Infinity Saga, was coming to an end? Well, it happened because for years, Marvel did not think that a female character could sell a superhero movie, because after Catwoman and Elektra bombed, they blamed it on having a female lead and that they did not want to take that risk again. That's why it was put off for so long. But at this point, the conversation around diversity and having more female representation in general and demands to not have it be such a boys' club were so loud, there was probably no way they couldn't get this movie made. And honestly, history is starting to repeat itself already, with characters like Miss Marvel in the beginning being created to put out there as a response to the demand for more female characters, a thing made to capitalize on the feminist movement at the time, even though that's looked different over the decades, rather than any passion behind the character. Because let me tell you, I highly doubt anyone behind the scenes making this film was passionate about the character. The marketing for Captain Marvel marketed her as a hero, which is very fitting. In the movie, unfortunately, Captain Marvel, Carol Danvers, isn't much of a character. Like the current comics coming out, she's confident, which actually translates to smugness the way that Brie Larson plays it up. There's really nothing behind that, though. We don't find out how she gained that confidence, aka smugness. We see that she's always gotten up off the ground whenever she's been pushed down, but we never find out where she developed to that point, how she got that resolve. We just see it there as an ideal, I guess. And lastly, there's this idea where characters are constantly mocking Carol Danvers for how she needs to control her emotions.
Control it. Lose control again and you'll have to commune with a supreme intelligence. There's nothing more dangerous to a warrior than emotion.
But she never does, and she decides at the end that it's okay to be set free. Except for she already was set free. She smugly just smiled away all the people who told her to need to control her emotions. This element in the movie is odd, and it has nothing to do with the way Carol Danvers' powers are supposed to work, or anything in her character, really. She's not portrayed as somebody who's out of control with her emotions, and it's not portrayed as if she's repressed in any way and needs to break free, because she never represses herself to begin with. The worst flaw Captain Marvel has in this movie is she's just confused as to where she is. And this is the same mistake that they were making with the character back in the first Miss Marvel series back in the late 70s. Captain Marvel, in case you haven't noticed in this movie, isn't an actual character. She's an amalgamation of all these different things that the writers, I guess, think say woman or feminist. For those who don't know, one of the biggest negative stereotypes against women is that they're just too out of control when it comes to their emotions, that we're just so emotional that we can't make logical decisions by ourselves. We're basically infants. So you can see how they just slap that on into the movie with no actual understanding how it was going to work. She doesn't go through an actual arc with it. It doesn't actually have to do with her character. It's this just anti-negative female stereotype of people telling you to control your emotions and you not actually having to, that's just slapped on there. Same as that there's just a random sexist that she needs to show a thing or two in the movie, or same that there's all these scenes, just vaguely not even connected scenes of her getting up when she falls down. It's like slogans. It's like cardboard cutout pieces of what feminist is supposed to mean, I guess, in the modern day, but it's not connected. It's all shallow. It's not making up an actual character. Carol Danvers' name, just as she was advertised as a hero in the advertisement of the movie, might as well just be named Woman in the movie.
The woman.
Because that's what she is, sort of this AI robotic example of what I guess a woman is supposed to be based on all of these things that are slapped onto her like stickers. But she's not an actual character. Doesn't have an actual compelling storyline. She's just all of these slogans and things that I guess are ideals for feminism, or at least what they think is an ideal for feminism and women in the modern day, but she's not an actual character. And she looks very different than she did back in the late 70s as the feminist movement has changed, but the same problem is there. Just like in the 70s, Carol checks all the boxes. She gets up when she falls down because that's what woman is supposed to do. She won't take it from men. She's confident because that's what a woman is supposed to be, but she's not an actual character. She's just a bunch of checked boxes. Just like in the 70s, she's written as a woman first and a character second. And by the way, I don't think it's a coincidence that Carol Danvers is the only character that's written like this. All of the other characters that Marvel tried, although there are other male characters, were actual characters with motivations, strengths, weaknesses, development, cohesive storytelling. Carol is the one character in the original Infinity Saga that didn't get any of that. And I have to say, history repeated itself. Just like in the original days of Miss Marvel, the character, there was no actual motivation or desire to write the character from most people at Marvel. She was just there to capitalize on whatever current feminist movement was going on at the time. That is exactly why Captain Marvel, the movie and character, exists at the time. Conversations around having women, strong female characters in action roles had been amping up during the 2010s for a while, and that was the response to capitalize on it. But these characters weren't taken care of, as you can see. Captain Marvel, because of their use of her, became the most hated character in the MCU, an icon for bad female characters. And in her wake would be a lot of other shallow female characters, most of which didn't have much to them, that weren't very successful, that the mainstream public just wrote off. There's no reason why female characters can't be well written, but no one behind the scenes either had the skill or the actual desire to write these characters as characters. They were just female. They were just women who were plastered across these films to fill out a quota as a response to criticism and hopefully capitalize on the new feminist movement of the day that at the time they thought would be profitable. But now that there's no profit, the characters are by and large gone. Which is just a sad thing to think about, because after all these years, we're still making the same mistakes with female characters, where they won't be written as actual characters by people who actually care about them. They're just shallow tokens. But the only difference now is, while in the past, I guess you would have people who criticize them for just being women but not actual characters, now you have people defending it and attacking anybody else who criticizes it. Part of the reason why these female characters who were badly written tokens lasted so long is you had people screaming about it and insisting that they exist, and that anybody who criticized the way they were done were just hating misogynists. Captain Marvel doesn't have fans, but she did have defenders, not defending her because she was a good character, but just against the supposed haters and pointing fingers and saying that those people were all of them misogynists. But you don't realize that this blind promotion of getting female characters in movies no matter what doesn't actually help the way that they are written. It doesn't actually create a desire behind the scenes, a passion for who these characters are. They just had to be slapped on screen to capitalize on a supposed trend of the time. And it's what makes me so mad about these supposed activists who claim to care about female characters in movies and in action scenarios, don't realize that the harm that they're doing, and don't realize that they're not actually supporting anything good. It's the Avengers 200 thing all over again. The people behind the scenes doing this just to capitalize on trends don't actually care about these female characters. That's why they're not well written. There might not be anything as heinous as Avengers 200 these days. That is just an example in the past of what happens when people behind the scenes don't actually care about the supposed female icons, the girl power, girl boss icons that they're promoting. Decades later, we are still in the same cycle. And to think that after all these years, now we've reached a point when there were actually a bunch of people defending this kind of depiction of female characters, this kind of shallow tokenism with nothing behind it. And you think about what happened back in the day and that the same thing is happening now, and it's just like, who are you people, and how can you claim to be the good guys in this situation? And how can you scream down at anybody who criticized how shallow these female characters were being written as misogynists when you are supporting the exact same kind of behavior that led to something like Avengers 200 being published? Female characters being looked at as nothing more than their gender and not being treated as actual characters. Surely after the story behind Avengers 200, maybe we could learn not to support such shallow tokenism and actually consider what is the motivation behind it all. Now, what is the response to all of this, and what is the response to Carol Danvers? Well, the truth is, as much as Captain Marvel and Carol Danvers has become a punching bag these days for badly written, tokenized female characters, I don't want the character to disappear, and I don't think she needs to. I think you perhaps need different casting after everything that's happened, but the truth is, she's not actually a bad character. When Claremont would write her in X-Men, or when the writers of Earth's Mightiest Heroes got a hold of her, she was actually a good character. There's still a lot to be written with her when it comes to Rogue's storyline, and that is the way forward. The problem is not that Carol Danvers is an inherently bad character. The problem is that she doesn't have more people writing her who see her as a character. But the question going forward is, are we finally going to learn the lessons of Avengers 200? Nothing good comes from shallow tokenism. Can we not recognize when companies are merely leaning into things like feminism or female characters, not because there's writers behind the scenes who actually are passionate about a story to tell, not because they're actually building a character and a world, but because they're just trying to capitalize on a trend. And where that can end up, well, in the past, it might have wound up with something even worse, like Avengers 200, now it's wound up with a bunch of hated female characters and a lot of people rejecting the idea of female action heroes in general because they're not used to seeing female action heroes written as actual characters that they can relate to. They're just used to what it is when female characters are just treated as nothing more than women. And that's a very unfortunate thing. So I'm just asking the question right now, are we ever going to ignore the voices that support this kind of tokenism, which I would say is the actual misogyny out there? And are we actually ever going to get writers that actually treat female characters as characters? The question right now is open-ended, and I don't know how it's going to end. And I don't know how it's going to change, but I hope that maybe with the knowledge of Avengers 200 and the actual history of Carol Danvers, people have more understanding of what is actually going on behind the scenes and how there never was any authentic progress made with these female characters and their representation. It was never a good thing to begin with to push female characters as nothing more than tokens to capitalize on a trend. That is all I got for you guys today. If you want to support my work and get your name in credits at the end of these videos, you can either check out channel memberships, which are now open, or on Patreon. There will be exclusive content both posted to either one of those that you want to sign up to. Thank you all for watching this very long video. I hope I was able to inform you about the truth of Carol Danvers. I hope that you know that she isn't an actual bad character. She's just been misused by the wrong people. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys next time.